The magazine Quillette has gained prominence as a home for free thought, and it bills itself as relying on, quote, reason, science, and humanism as our guiding values, unquote. How has this magazine approached the 20th century's leading philosophic advocate of reason, Ayn Rand? Well, we got a sense of that recently when Quillette ran a piece about Ayn Rand titled The Eyes Have It. The piece itself is disappointing, to put it mildly, and we'll talk a bit about that today. And I think there are some wider philosophic issues that it brings up. So for exploring this piece, I invited these two colleagues of mine, Keith Lockitch and Robert Mayhew. Keith works at the Institute alongside me, and Robert Mayhew is a philosophy professor at Seton Hall University and a member of the ARI's board of directors. Welcome both.
Good to be here.
Hi.
So I thought the place to start is just to give a picture of what Quillette is and why it's significant, and then to unpack a bit why we're responding to this piece, because I think there's an argument for, as we'll say, as we'll bring out, that there's not much value in the piece, so why comment on it? What is it that's significant here? So for people who don't know about Quillette, because it's not a major publication the way, say, the New York Times Magazine or the New Yorker is, maybe Robert or Keith, you can tell us a bit about how Quillette started. What is its differentiating feature? What does it make it so salient today?
Maybe I mean, Robert, my understanding of it, or were you going to jump in, Robert?
No, you start.
Okay. Yeah, my understanding is it started out as a new intellectual publication that's trying to have an alternative to, the sort of standard tribalism of the left and the right. So it's heterodox compared to the mainstream media, and they had, at least early on, there was a lot of very reputable scholars and intellectuals who were writing for them. I remember, one piece that stood out for me was a year after Steven Pinker's Enlightenment Now was published, Quillette published a lengthy article by him looking at all the discussion that generated and some of the reviews. And it was very interesting discussion. And the idea of being able to take on issues that are starting to be considered unmentionable or not, viewpoints that other people refuse to discuss. This is supposed to be a home for those sorts of heterodox ideas, and to hold their authors to a very high standard. So that's, when it first came out, that's what struck me about the publication.
Yeah, I would add my familiarity with it is mostly articles written by academics who were canceled or fired or otherwise denied the freedom of expression that their institutions claim to be champions of. And there's some very good pieces, and in some of these cases, it's only a vehicle like this that allows them to publish their views. So I've been very pleased. The other area is, I know there's been scientists and academics who've had heterodox views on transgender issues that can only find a place to express their views in Quillette, maybe Medium too, I guess. So that's been my exposure to the magazine, and so far it's been very positive. And this, as you said, Elan, very disappointing for many reasons, but one of them is that this is an entirely orthodox view, in a sense, and perverse one about Ayn Rand. It's not at all what you'd expect, given what we've come to expect from Quillette, or at least what I've seen there.
And so in particular, it's the fact that it's a place for people to bring ideas that are not, so there's a seriousness about the discussion of ideas that was there, which we'll get to this, but you don't see that at all in this piece. So.
Yeah, so why don't we unpack that a bit? Let's talk a bit about the article. So the title, as I said earlier, is The Eyes Have It. Eyes as in, yeah, there we go. Yeah, I see it on the screen. And one of the, so you've said it's a conventional or orthodox view of Ayn Rand. So this is the part where I was feeling really conflicted about doing this podcast and discussion about the article, because to talk about it is to give it a certain kind of respectability that I don't think it really warrants. But I think it, as I suggested, I think it does raise other wider things, and it's interesting as a cultural artifact, the way people approach Ayn Rand, how they try to process her ideas, and what that looks like. So a couple of things to start with is what is the piece ostensibly about? What is the point of this piece? And I think the most charitable account is it's trying to illustrate the fact that Ayn Rand has a strong and enduring appeal with young people, and then to suggest a little bit why that is. And I don't think it actually succeeds in doing either of those things, really. It brings up and rehashes various things that you keep hearing about Ayn Rand, and it leans on sources that I think are beneath dubious. And it's mainly critical, relying on secondary sources. The one thing that leapt out at me when I read it the first time is how little of Ayn Rand there actually is in the piece. I mean, the piece mentions a few things about her in very broad strokes, but you don't get any flavor, let alone the substance of what Ayn Rand is about, in her own words, or at least in some accurate formulations of what she stands for. So that's one observation I had. The other one, and I don't want to make this conversation a detailed, factual analysis of where this piece goes wrong, because I think my assessment is it's an incompetent piece. Or the editing is incompetent at Quillette when they process this piece, because they let through some very obvious factual errors or misconceptions. One of them is about the idea that for Ayn Rand, this idea of a new intellectual, this conception of a new intellectual who stands for reason as against superstition and faith, that's inherently someone who's young. And I don't think that's exactly what she meant. And I think if you read her statement on this, if you listen to her interviews on the subject, I don't think she's restricting it has to be young people. I think it's anyone who's open to reason. And I think her vision was that it would be a range of different people. And then there are just quotes attributed to Ayn Rand, just another example of this shoddiness, I think, in terms of the processing of this piece. A quote attributed to Ayn Rand from the Fountainhead that you see on T-shirts and you see on bumper stickers, and people are really fond of it. And it's not actually what the original statement is. This is from a scene in the Fountainhead early on, where the lead character is talking to the dean of the architecture school that he's attending and is being expelled from. And the statement that people hear is, and it's circulating on the internet, is, it's not who's going to stop me, it's who's, it's, I'm mangling the quotation here, but it's this idea that it's not who's going to let me.
Who's going to let me, it's who's going to stop me, yeah.
Yeah,
but he doesn't even cite it as being from the Fountainhead. It's Ayn Rand used to say, like she went around saying that. You know?
Yeah, so it's not accurate of the Fountainhead, and I don't think she actually walked around saying this, and it's just the sort of thing that you would pick up and rehash from the internet. So there's just some quick observations on that. I'm interested to hear from each of you, sort of your observations on the piece as an attempt to articulate certain views.
Yeah, if I could, I'd say, first of all, I believe she claimed that you don't really count as an intellectual intellectual till you're 40 or over. So the idea that she thought that it was young people who are these intellectuals, you have to start young. You want to try to train them and give them an education that they're not getting in the universities, perhaps. But yeah, that was just one of the stupid things in the article. Now, to add, you had mentioned he wanted to. A charitable description is describe the phenomenon of young people being enthusiastic about Ayn Rand and explain why. But I think it's important that he also wants to dismiss it as juvenile. And that's an important part of what he's doing. He doesn't make an argument for it. It's just this rehashing of cliches, snide remarks, and with the idea that, maybe for you people out there who are excited about her now, you'll hopefully grow up and be more realistic, or whatever his alternative is, because he doesn't give us much. sorry, Karl Popper. But yeah, so I'd also comment on with the cliches. I thought it was shocking how unoriginal it was. That is, we've heard it all. Those of us who have been around for a while with an interest and love of Ayn Rand, we've heard this over and over and over again from all kinds of different people. And I remember reading it, and it got off to a bad start. The only original comment he makes is the opening line about her dark cinematic eyes enthralling young people. I've never heard that before. I don't think I've heard that older people who met her found her eyes really, engaging or what have you. But young people aren't. That's not what does it for young people. And since that's supposed to be what the article is about, he just doesn't get it from the opening sentence, and it just cascades. And there's all the usual. Some of the cliches are really despicable ones. The claim about she's the fact that her ideas are somehow a product of the fact that the Bolsheviks treated her family unkind. That's why she became a critic of socialism. It's so superficial and unoriginal. So and that's kind of the tenor of the whole article.
Yeah, I mean, what's especially disappointing here, it's a sort of pseudo biographical discussion. There's no discussion of her ideas. If you want to understand Ayn Rand's appeal to young people, you have to look at her ideas and engage with her ideas. Just giving her life story and talking about her experiences under communism, that's not getting at what people find inspiring and appealing about her thought. I mean, one thing that stood out to me is he talks about her novels, and then he says she's sought after not only for her novels but also for her nonfiction, her slim volumes of collected essays and old newspaper columns and other outtakes. So she has a body of nonfiction writing that represents a set of seminal and deeply philosophical essays that offer a radical perspective on the world, on morality, on fundamental issues in philosophy, and he's calling these outtakes. So, I mean, that by itself suggests that, at one point he says he thinks she's worth reading carefully, but I don't see any evidence that this author has made any attempt to read her carefully.
Yeah, I could add.
Go ahead.
One more thing about the article. I don't know how much time we want to spend on it. I found there was something pitiful about it, or sad, in that it seemed to be a display on the part of the author of exactly what Ayn Rand comments on and criticizes in talking about the spirit of youth, what is wonderful about being young, and the unfortunate, and the people who don't get it. And she talks at length in some of her essays, Art and Moral Treason, how parents do certain things to kind of squash the spirit of youth. She talks about, and we might return to this in The Inexplicable Personal Alchemy, about what is one of the great things about being young is this conviction that ideas matter. And she has this idea, some hold it for their entire lives, some only in their youth, and some never get it at all. And you get the idea, reading this article as it progresses, this poor bastard never had it, or he dropped it. And I think it might actually be the latter, in the sense that he talks about having once liked Ayn Rand, but then he matured. And it's, maturity is your term, his term for betraying what convictions actually lit a fire in him, however briefly and however dim. Right. So it was sad in that respect, and I don't think we'd be talking about it if he were the only one who presented these ideas. So.
I want to come back to that in a minute. There's just one final thought to just round out the observations about the piece itself, because I don't want to spend too much time on it. So the final thought I wanted to offer is that, in view of what the promise of Quillette was when it started and some of the high points that it reached, I think I've read interesting articles there. I think Coleman Hughes published a number of articles there about race today that I thought were really penetrating. And as you said, Keith, they publish often excerpts from interesting books and some reputable scholars that you might recognize. And so if you think of the publication at its peak or at its best, whenever that is, and I tried to assess it yesterday. I read a number of articles to see, because I've lost touch with what they're doing. It's quite variable. I mean, holding them to what their vision was, I'm really disappointed that they published this. I really don't think it's worthy of what their goal is. And I have trouble taking them seriously after this as an intellectual publication. It's not, as you guys pointed out in different ways, it's nothing, there's nothing fresh here. There's no originality. There's nothing heterodox. This is sort of very conventional, towing the line of the criticisms that are circulating for many years. And I think it's sad because, as you said, Robert, there were things about Quillette that were admirable, that they were willing to publish people that were unpublishable or you couldn't talk about them. And for me, just to zoom out a bit, I don't know if we can hold all the editors accountable and say they all agreed to publish this, because I know some journals, they don't always agree with what they publish and they don't always have uniformity among their decision makers. I don't know what they did in this case. I know they do publish things they don't agree with, but I would be surprised if they gave this treatment to someone like Charles Murray, whom they talk about quite a bit and try to give visibility to, who's a very controversial scholar, or someone like Steven Pinker, whom they publish frequently and talk to on their podcast, or somebody that is in the sciences, or someone like Christopher Hitchens, who was very controversial and he made a whole career out of being heterodox in different times and different places. I can't imagine they would treat him with this kind of snide and superior attitude that is not even engaging with the substance of what the scholar did. So to me, that's the core of my disappointment in what they did. And there's much more we could talk about, and I think it would just become tedious if we try to unpack the particular failings of this piece and the selection of this author for writing. It's not clear why he'd be positioned to talk about it. But I want to come back to the point you just raised, Robert, about this idea of what is it about Ayn Rand that appeals to young people? What is her conception of the best aspects of youth? And then the further point that you raised, which is that the perspective of people who look down on that and try to crush it and so forth. So maybe you could tell us a bit about, so how does she think about the spirit of youth, or what's good about youthfulness?
Well, I think it's a number of views, or it's a cluster of ideas. It's the idea that ideas matter, that we can discover the truth, and it's important to try to discover the truth, that it makes a difference in your life whether you discover the truth or not, whether you have the right ideas, that what is good and right and true is possible here on earth. It's worth pursuing. All of that she sees is wrapped up in what is exciting about being a young person, if they haven't been destroyed in their youth. And all of that it's a central part of her philosophy, that the mind is capable of grasping the truth. We ought to be confident in our mind's ability, that one ought to pursue the truth for one's own sake, that it is, she called this the benevolent universe outlook, that one can achieve values here on earth, whatever stumbling there is, whatever obstacles one meets, and that one can achieve it again here on earth. There's that idea that how does Kira put it? Not to imagine a heaven and not to dream of it, but to demand it. That's part of, it's not just young people generally what she's commenting on, it's her own conception of what young people ought to be pursuing and commenting on. But it's an observation that goes beyond her own philosophy. She sees this is what excites people in their youth, and unfortunately, too many of them they lose it, right? And I think this is an important part of it's an important part of the answer to the question: why don't these people attack Christopher Hitchens and Charles Murray? And I would put it differently in a way: why don't they attack? Why don't or they make fun of? Why do you have people like this criticizing? I don't know, young people who adopt their parents' religious convictions, right? That, you know, those are much more widespread than there are young people who are enthralled by the fountainhead. So I think this whole outlook that there are ideals. It's important that we try to discover the truth, pursue them. I mean, I think that's what is really behind this criticism. They want to dismiss all of that as um, as immature, and I think
Can
they
I?
have. It's not just Ayn Rand. I think it's. I can imagine if one of these people or Alan Bloom or whatever, if they met some young person who says, "I read Cyrano de Bergerac every year because it, you know, really it makes me stand up to, you know, what I believe in." I think they would find that as immature. It wouldn't be as fun criticizing it because it's not Ayn Rand, but I think that whole cluster of what's so important, things that are important to Ayn Rand, that they dismiss as as wrong or worse. Right?
As well, or I remember who said it before as juvenile, but just I think part of it is also it's the idea that holding values is important. You know, just having values that you are passionate about. And what's interesting is the people they're trying to criticize here are people who value Ayn Rand. They value her, like they hold her novels and her ideas as something that they're passionate about, that they're interested in. So in the same way that they're generally trying to sneer, you know, they want people to mature out of the idea that it's important to hold ideals and to pursue values and to have passions. Um, they want to um, uh, also, specifically the fact that people value her and her ideas, they want to attack that and smear that and dismiss that. I think it's an expression of the same general thing, that they want to apply this to people's interest in Ayn Rand and dismiss it as immature and juvenile.
So one observation to connect with what you were raising, Robert and Keith, thinking back to what I found resonant in the Fountainhead when I first read it, and then what I've heard other people talk about, I think it's the two important truths here. One, she understood something deep about what it is that is good about youth and idealism and the value that sort of this experience that we have and that she characterizes as a conviction that we have that our life matters, knowledge matters, and the truth matters. And it's almost felt like a self-evident truth that you can't not believe it. So I think she has that observation. I think the second truth here is that in her fiction, we experience people, fully formed characters who have that in them. So the heroes really have this commitment to the truth and to the values that matter in life and to their judgment. And they're the ones, part of what's interesting about the heroes, they don't give that up. That's part of what makes them heroic and enables them to achieve great things. And I think that some part of what people respond to in Ayn Rand is that they don't see that anywhere else. It's very unusual to see that dramatized. And it's also, I think you had raised this point in an earlier conversation before we went live, Robert, that there's something about fiction that makes the portrayal of that fact, or this whole idea of idealism, so much more powerful than if I just characterized it in a nonfiction description. It's just, you get to experience it in such a powerful way. And I think that when people experience Ayn Rand, they have a sense of what this is about. Then they encounter the characters and the stories and the trials that they go through, and it becomes even more real in their minds. It helps them conceive, sort of put in conceptual terms, what is so hard to name and yet is there or ever present in their thinking. I'm curious your reactions to that.
Well, she says, I mean, in a number of places in her aesthetical writings that, again, our author didn't read, I think. she says that art is the indispensable means of presenting a moral ideal, and particularly romantic literature, she thinks is crucial to presenting, to properly orienting a child towards the sort of things Keith was talking about earlier, that this respect for values, this love of values. And she has this wonderful essay, Art and Moral Treason. And the treason is the squashing of that desire in children at a fairly young age. But it's there's something about romantic literature that's very youthful, and even the romanticists themselves saw themselves as kind of young upstarts in a way. But it's this, what romantic art gives you for her is this presentation of an ideal, and one that is realizable. Now, Hugo might be different from Ayn Rand, obviously, but that's basically the characteristic of the genre or the school. It allows you to contemplate it it allows you to experience it. It's a confirmation that this is what is possible. And it gives you the fuel, she says, to pursue it. And this is what young people, if they haven't been really messed up by their parents or their culture or what have you, it's natural for them to want that and to need it. And she says it's interesting, by contrast, what irrational people seek in art is not what I just described, but a justification of their malevolent or depraved view of the world. And what they want is not a confirmation. I forget how she puts it exactly. It's not a confirmation about what is possible. It's a permission to stand still. And she means by that, it's permission not to have to pursue an ideal. And I think that outlook is behind all of these attacks on her as being, or not attacks on her, but also on young people who respond to her. These are people who reject entirely the importance of romantic literature and everything that involves, which is a lot.
So I wanted to just probe that a little more. So I'm old enough to remember, you know where this is going. I am old enough to remember, I think it was Hillary Clinton at some point in her career commenting on Ayn Rand and having the zinger or the put down of, yes, we read Ayn Rand when we were young and then we grow up. And so it's echoed in this piece from Quillette. And I forget exactly the wording, but Barack Obama had a similar statement that, yes, it's for young people, but then when we realize what the world's really about, we obviously turn our backs on that. Let's not be juvenile here. And I'm not picking on them just to isolate them because of where they are politically, but I just, as two very prominent people who've had this view, I don't think it's unique to any particular place on the intellectual landscape. But I think it's interesting that it's a kind of, it's definitely a cliche. That's what it. And I think part of what is interesting about that is, I think some element of it is reputation management. It's okay, I admit I read her. Yeah, I did it because you're supposed to read it. But I'm not the kind of person that you think I am if you think I like her still. I'm better than that. And there's something in it that is self-condemnatory in my view. It's that you care so much about what people think about you. Why do you care what they think about you? It's this sort of Peter Keating mentality. Is, don't worry, I'm not really that sort of individual person who thinks for themselves and takes Ayn Rand seriously. And I'm not trying to prejudice this in a certain way, but I think there's definitely that sort of reputation management, which what I find interesting about that is the circles those sorts of people travel in. There has to be some clear or unstated expectations that this you can't be serious if you have an interest in Ayn Rand. And I met people like that in various contexts, various scholars and intellectuals, and I find that really disappointing. I'm not sure if you guys have seen that or what your thoughts are.
Well, I've seen some of that in some people, but I think in the case of Hillary and Obama, it's a symptom of their more fundamental betrayal. That that is, I don't think they secretly love Ayn Rand back at home and still peruse their old copies of The Fountainhead. I think to get where they did politically, you have to sell your soul. And I mean, Hillary really had no ideals. I mean, she had whatever was out there, but she would turn on a dime, I think, if it would help her win an election. And Obama, he had a reputation of being this idealist, but what kind of change is he advocating? Change you can believe in, but there's no content anywhere. And it's I think in his case, he said, I think was it Rand Paul or these people who were in the news. Some of the politicians who were talking about Ayn Rand, and we all read her when we were young, and that's kind of that's the attitude. But I don't. I think there are people I've met who I know a couple cases where people have when they knew I was a scholar of ancient philosophy, but didn't know about the Rand stuff, and sent me kind of private emails. I loved her when I was in high school, and not in the sense that now I know better, but I think it was letting something out that they can't do too often in public. And so I think that's true. And it's strange for people who've responded to The Fountainhead, that especially that would be how you treat your love of Ayn Rand, if there is such a thing. But I don't think it's something. I'll give Hillary and Obama enough integrity to. Yeah, I think they're consistent enough that they probably loathe her way down. Yeah.
There's I think an interesting and profound moment in one of the interviews that Ayn Rand did. I think it's right at the beginning of the interview. The interviewer says to her, your opponents think you're daft, don't they? And she says, no, they don't. And he's like, what? No, they don't. They want you to think that. And I think that is what really explains, why is it that we see a constant stream of articles like this? Oh, yes, she's wonderful. I loved her when I was young, but then you have to grow out of it and mature and be smarter. Why does Paul Krugman feel the need to repeat the same smear at least twice a year in his column? That this line of attack. I don't think it's that they really think this. I think they're desperate to make sure that they squash the idealism that she inspires in young people, and they want to find some pretext to try to convince people that she's not worth taking seriously. And I think that also explains why these articles don't engage with her ideas at all. Because if you actually start looking at some of the interesting, original, radical ideas that she had, then the game is lost, because there's so much that's profound and inspiring and interesting to young people, especially in her ideas.
Yeah, I think for that type, the Empress is beautifully dressed, and they want to try to convince people that she's naked, and that's what they're. I think that they're aware at some level that there's something there, and so you hear these even like Hitchens and Alan Bloom, who was mentioned in the piece, they clearly she's not literature, but these young people like her.
Well,
what standards are they?
Yeah, I was just going to ask you, Robert. Let's talk a bit about who Alan Bloom was, just for context. So he was a scholar at University of Chicago, I think, for many years, and he wrote a surprising bestseller called The Closing of the American Mind. Just give us a little bit more flavor of what kind of scholar he was and the way he characterized Rand. Because I know it's in the piece, but I think it's worth sort of lifting up and elevating the context.
Well, he's an unusual figure. He was probably the star student of Leo Strauss, if you've heard of him. This kind of conservative, but in an unusual kind of conservative. They were very much in the idea that ideas matter, books matter, great books matter. We need to go back to the ancients to find solutions. So all that might sound good. And Alan Bloom especially, he thought books were really important. He taught not only, you hear these stories about how wonderful his seminars on Plato's Republic, on Rousseau, all these things are, but also in literature. He used to co-teach literature courses with Saul Bellow on Shakespeare's plays, on Anna Karenina and Jane Austen and things like that, I believe. So in Closing of the American Mind, he's bemoaning the fact that, and I can understand this, and this is late 80s, right, when the book came out. He's bemoaning the fact that American college students don't love books. They don't have a favorite book that they really turn to for inspiration and joy, regularly. And in that context, he mentions, well, the exception, some people mention the Bible, but they don't really, take it seriously as a sacred text. He says something along those lines. And then there's always someone who'll mention Ayn Rand. But he dismisses that as hardly literature and, sub-Nietzschean. But that is really dishonest. And it's strange, because what you want to ask of him is, then what are you looking for? You're clearly discouraged that young people don't want literature. And here they are coming to you with this recent literary work. Where do you want them to find inspiration and all that? And it's not at all clear. Now, I think, I know something about him. I've studied Alan Bloom, his kind of works on Plato and all that. I think he's very much a Shakespearean figure in a way. He has this Olympian detachment. What fools these mortals be. And we read the great work. In fact, his interpretation of Plato's Republic is that Plato is not an idealist. He's making an argument as to why it's a disaster to try to pursue ideals. And so it's really, again, it's not about, he doesn't take the time to read her and wonder why is she not literature and Dostoevsky is. I don't think he would take Cyrano de Bergerac or Hugo very seriously. He doesn't talk about them, although he writes a lot about literary figures. So there's something more going on, and I think it's that he wants something. He wants them to love books, but in an old kind of great books conservative way. And it's not just that there's not enough people who have said she's great. It's that there's something about her view of what great literature is, what is philosophical truth, that just is so alien to someone like that. So he's a much more sophisticated, much more interesting person than this guy whose name I can't remember, who wrote the article that got us started today. But it's still as depressing, and in a way even worse, that here's someone who's complaining about American college students, and he has a lot to complain about. I mean, he talked about, all American college students are moral relativists, and what a problem that was, and things like that. So, but now he gets a chance to actually engage with some students and talk to them about what they love about the novels that mean so much to them, and he dismisses them. And God knows what he says to them in class when they raise their hand and mention Ayn Rand. But you can see the eyes rolling and the dismissive.
And I had a similar reaction to Steven Pinker's take on Ayn Rand, because I read Enlightenment Now, which is a brilliant book. I mean, and a lot of what he has to say is so important and so valuable. And he's sending out a clarion call for a return to Enlightenment values. And if there's any thinker in the 20th century who can lay the philosophical foundations for a return to the Enlightenment, it's Ayn Rand. And he doesn't engage with her at all. The one place he mentions her, he just sort of dismisses her as warmed over Nietzsche. And that's an unfortunate.
And that's why it's important. I mean, his only knowledge of Ayn Rand. 'Cause I think what happened is you get these people who love Ayn Rand who talk to, you really ought to read her. You really ought to. So he reads Jennifer Burns. That's his source, and that's a tragedy that he would go to that source. Biography, which is, I've written a review of the book. I think it's a terrible book, but that if that's all the trouble you're going to take, that's the view she presents. She's among other things a warmed over Nietzschean. So that's a big pity, because Pinker, there's a lot in him that he doesn't think we're conscious or have free will, but he's a real champion of reason. And I mean, I don't mean that that's kind of a nasty remark, but it's just a strange aspect of him because he's so good on so many issues. It's just really unfortunate. He could have been, I think, a real ally there. But
before we go to the one more question to close out the conversation, I wanted to acknowledge all of those watching and who have contributed to the super chat. We really appreciate your support. Thank you for that. That's very welcome, and we're glad to have you. I don't know if we'll get a lot of time for questions today, but I did want to come back to one topic from earlier in the conversation. So we started with this article that's disappointing, to put it charitably. It's inept. It doesn't really engage with Ayn Rand. There's a lot of things wrong with it. And I think the wider, more interesting issue is this perspective on why it is people have this recurring comment on Ayn Rand that it's something to outgrow, and bashing the idealism that people respond to in her. I wanted to go back to, you raised this question, Keith, when we were planning this conversation. It's, well, why are we talking about this article if it's that bad? And I think part of the answer is just that there are wider issues here. But I wanted to throw it back to you because I think you have some thoughts on this.
I mean, as we've discussed, this isn't the first article like this. These articles come out from time to time. Usually you see them in a publication like Salon or something where we wouldn't even pay attention to it. But we've, in the past, the attitude that we would take is why even discuss this at all? Like there isn't really anything here that's worthy of commentary. There isn't a serious attempt to talk about Ayn Rand, about her ideas. There's always this sort of tone of snide snarkiness, and it's just a hit piece. So why even bother talking about it? But we've started to do this a little more with pieces that we in the past might not have, because, on the premise that if there are people, maybe people who are newer to Ayn Rand's ideas and who just don't have the knowledge, don't know in what ways this is a distortion or is ignoring her ideas or makes comments about her ideas that are just false. And it's worth it to offer a different perspective. So we've had a number. You wrote an article, Elan, sort of dissecting two pieces, one from Salon and one that was published in National Review. So opposite sides, in a certain sense, of the intellectual spectrum. Both of them were just totally meritless hit pieces. And your article wasn't, it was really more about the method behind these pieces and what does that tell you about the seriousness with which people are taking Ayn Rand, or the lack of seriousness. And I think it's worth bringing those kinds of issues to light for the sake of people who might be newer and might not really have the knowledge to understand what's wrong with them or to counter them.
Yeah, let me add to that one other thought, which is one of the things we do, one of my colleagues has a project of tracking different articles about Ayn Rand, and we keep track of it, and we're interested in how people talk about her and what they say. And so once in a while we do the sort of thing you're describing, which is respond to some of these meritless pieces, and it's kind of a drudgery for me sometimes to read them, and not the fun part of my job, I have to say. But I do find it interesting, and in doing this, one of the things that I think is important is to get to the substance and the positive aspect of what it is about Ayn Rand that people don't like. So what is it? What's the value here? And I think some of what you've raised, Robert, I think is central to that. It's this conception of what youth is and the value of idealism that she presents in her fiction and in other places. So with that in mind, I wanted just to recap some of the essays that we mentioned in the conversation for people, and we will include these in the show notes with links for people to find them. But I think the one place to go to read Ayn Rand's view of what is the spirit of youth and idealism is the essay Inexplicable Personal Alchemy. And I have to say, the title doesn't really help you understand what the essay is about. It's it's not but it's a captivating piece. I reread it this morning. You mentioned art and moral treason.
That's
Was
right.
there another one that you mentioned in the aesthetics? I forget.
Art and sense of life. She deals. Those are both in the Romantic Manifesto, right?
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, and inexplicable personal alchemy is it's been in the collection, the Return of the Primitive. I'd mentioned
She
there's
talks about in the introduction to the Fountainhead. She talks about the spirit of youth as well. I think there's a brief discussion of it there.
and you get, I mean, in the portrayal of Kira in We the Living, there's an essay by Ben Baer in essays on. There's a volume called Essays on Ayn Rand's The Fountainhead, and Ben has this really good essay on the Fountainhead and the spirit of youth. I don't know if I've got the title right, but that's basically it. Could I, Elan, I think there's been one omission. Could I comment on
Sure. Yeah,
one point I want to
please.
make? We're talking about Ayn Rand's positive philosophy. This is really the opposite of it. But I think one of the things that we haven't mentioned as to why they're so bad. I mean, some of these attacks are so bad. Where is it coming from? Why are they attacking her view of ideals and pursuing them? And I think it's the ethics of altruism. I think people are being raised on, I mean, morality just is the altruist morality. And if that's your view, if your view is that the good is to sacrifice yourself for others, then that is a blatant contradiction with her whole idea of what is exciting about being young. Because what's exciting about being young is, what am I going to do with myself and my life? It doesn't mean you're going to, destroy people, who get in your way or anything weird like that. It just means there's something inherently egoistic about it, properly understood. And I think altruism squashes that. And that's why, if you look at, I think one of the things to ask is, when people write these kind of essays, well, what is their view of the ideal? What do they think young people ought to be doing, right? And what they think tends to be, unless they're completely cynical and people are all scum or whatever, they think their idea of idealism is what's that expression? Something bigger than oneself, right? You got to find some project or whatever. You work for the environment, or you help poor people in some, but it's not about you, and in any rich sense. And I think that's a really important thing that's behind this. That, I mean, it's been implied in a lot of what we've talked about, but I think it's worth underscoring.
So thanks for adding that. I wanted to, as we close now the conversation, I wanted to mention, you mentioned the book Essays on Ayn Rand's The Fountainhead, and the essay by Ben Baer in that. So for people watching who are new to Ayn Rand, or who want to explore more, or want to understand her better, because I think that's the goal of my bringing this up, and what motivated me to have a conversation about this piece is, okay, forget the piece, go explore Ayn Rand, see what's really going on, because I think there's an inadvertent advertising that these sorts of pieces have for certain kinds of readers, which is, why are you working so hard to bash her? There must be something here. I'm going to go look at it. And part of my motivation is to say to people, yes, it's true. They're telling you it's not worth reading, because it is worth reading. And I'd love for people to go and explore, read her novels, read her nonfiction. And then when you've done that, if you really want to dive deeper, I wanted to mention the essay collections you worked to put together, Robert. So there's a set of essay books, essays on Ayn Rand's, and then each novel: Anthem, We the Living, The Fountainhead, Atlas Shrugged, and there you go, great. And I have to say, that is just such a wealth of serious scholarship, engagement with her ideas, with her literature, and there's so much to learn about Ayn Rand. So one reason is, I don't think that's the place people should start. They should start with Ayn Rand, read everything she has to say that interests you. But if you want to see what it looks like actually to engage with her thought, take a look at these books of essays. And then there's still more scholarship that's coming out that we could talk about, but that's for another conversation. And I think it's useful to have that contrast of, if Quillette is really the home for free thought, what does it look like to engage with Ayn Rand? It does not look like what they published. It looks more like the sort of thing that you have helped to bring out in those books and in other places. So I want to put that on the record. I've found them really valuable, and I want other people to know about those books. So let's draw a line here. Any final thoughts? I want to make sure we don't skip anything. If you had any last closing remarks.
Well, we had this one question that came in over Zoom about whether we considered inviting someone from Quillette. I mean, we have reached out to the editors to see if if they're interested in a not like a rebuttal or a piece about Ayn Rand from us that takes her seriously and offers a view for the readers of Quillette of why they should take her seriously and be interested. So so we have reached out to the editors in that way, and we'll see if they take that up.
Yeah, and I want to say my goal is not to. I mean, I have a different evaluation of Quillette now than I did, say, a couple of weeks ago before this piece came out. But I still am open to them being to growing and becoming a valuable place. I don't think one piece is going to completely destroy a reputation, but I think it's going to harm their reputation for sure. And I could see the value in publishing there in the future if they improve and so on. Okay, so thanks. Let me thank you, Keith, for joining, and Robert, thanks for taking time. I know you have a busy week with finals and so on. Thanks for joining us today. And thanks to all of you for listening and watching us. If you enjoyed this, we'd love for you to leave a comment, share, tell people about it, click on the subscribe button and click on the bell so you get notifications. We want to amplify the message here and get more people to engage with what we do. So if you're watching on YouTube, go ahead, click those buttons. On Facebook and other platforms, please do the same. Share, let people know, that helps us reach more people through those algorithms.
Elan, we should mention that we now have a TikTok account too. So if you're on TikTok, search for Ayn Rand __ and you'll find us.
Yeah, you can find us. And we just published something yesterday that I think will resonate with some of the people who happen to be very young, and we're interested in connecting with young people. So yes, if you're interested in you can explore that on TikTok. So we'll be back next week with a new topic. And until then, thanks for watching.